Welcome to the Engage and Empower podcast. Behind every successful company is an intentional and innovative approach to empowering your most valuable asset, your people. Join me in having conversations with people and talent leaders as we share our journeys and unpack what it takes to build strong, cohesive teams and employee experiences. From executives at early-stage startups to innovators at large public companies, we'll capture the compelling stories of the people behind people teams. Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning into the Engage and Empower podcast. I'm your host, Rasika Rajagopalan, and today I am beyond thrilled to be chatting with someone I consider to be one of my most influential mentors, as well as a good friend, Laura Parrott, the head of people at Floyd. I met Laura many years ago when I was actually embarking upon creating this manager development program internally for my company. And I've learned a lot from her about that and many, many other things in the process. So I'm sure we'll dig into all of that and more over the next hour. So Laura, thank you so much for making time for the show. If you wouldn't mind getting us started by giving listeners just a quick background and intro on you and Floyd, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Rasika, for having me here. I'm delighted. I'll give a very quick background, but I've been in this people space for more than 15 years now. I spent about 8 years at McKinsey as a recruiter, and then I spent 7 years at Google, where I cut my teeth on people development and manager development and leadership development. And I translated that into a role at HubSpot, where I got to do a lot of building around manager development there. Along the way, I built up my side business where I was working with small organizations, which is how we got to know each other. And then last year, I decided to move back to Michigan. And that is when I took on a role at Floyd, which we are an e-commerce furniture company that is based here in Detroit, but like a lot of organizations right now, working remotely.
I love your background because not only have you worked across the full gamut of people and talent, whether that be recruiting, learning and development, now, you're leading an entire people team. You've also been in so many different types of environments. You've worked in consulting, you've been at big tech companies, really, really early stage startups. So you've seen a lot. And I want to rewind back to your role at Google. I know you talked a lot about how influential your time was there, or we've talked about in the past, and how you've learned a breadth of foundational concepts and skills there that really paved the way for what you spent the bulk of your career doing in the leadership development space. So I'd love to hear more about what that experience was like and what you took from it that you continue to apply today in your roles.
Google was a place, I was there from 2010 to 2017. So I know a lot has changed and it's significantly grown in size since then. It was a large company then when I was there, but I also felt like it was a company that was more open to creativity and innovation, even in the people development space, or I should say, especially in that space. So it was really nice to be able to have the permission to come up with some wacky ideas and, do your best to kind of present a data fact-based argument as to why these could have value, but then have some space to experiment and play around. So I think that was really fun. And I also, at the same time, saw what learning and development and leadership development and manager development looks like at scale and arguably sort of best of class. I got such a strong foundation on a lot of the skills and frameworks that I still use today with people leaders. And I also, now that I work with smaller organizations, I can see into the future a little bit and anticipate some of the challenges that could come as we grow and scale and do my very best to figure out how we can anticipate those and maybe even work with or around them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think having that space to experiment and create was probably a great segue into what you subsequently did, which is spend many years building and facilitating leadership development programs of your own, whether it was through Intelligently or at HubSpot, Eager Labs. And one of the topics that I loved learning from you was this concept of navigating change and conflict. And I love it because, for one, of course, as we all know, change is the one thing that's always constant. It affects every part of our jobs and our lives. And so often I find that we approach those circumstances with others in the way that we hope to be supported, or we compromise on issues we should collaborate on, or we provide strong directive around issues we should be discovering more around. So as you work with leaders and, as you build some of these workshops and trainings, how do you approach guiding your leaders and employees through change, and what frameworks and models do you use to help your team think about that?
Yeah, it's a very timely question, Ruska, because one of the things that I've been trying to do at Floyd is bring about quarterly learning topics. So we're small enough, we're about 50 people. We can learn something together as a company. And the topic for this quarter is navigating change. So we arguably could have done it sooner, but it seemed especially apt for the times. So there are two simple frameworks that I think are really powerful to keep in mind to help you with change, because to your point, it's a constant and it's not going to go away. So one is, I really like Stephen Covey's circles or spheres of influence and control. And just really like the idea there is pretty simple, is that the only thing that we have control over is how we react to something. It's ourselves, right? What we say, what we do. Everything else falls either in the circle of influence or the outer circle in which we have no control and no influence. So if you can use that sort of framework to recognize that when it comes to navigating change, your desire to control the change isn't worthwhile because you can't, right? We're usually in a position where we're all reacting to the change. So if we can let go of trying to control the change, what we can control is the transition. And that's a really internal process. That's our thoughts, our feelings, our beliefs, how we're reacting to everything that the change is bringing up. Hand in hand with that goes the change curve, which is just a really simple model that's, again, none of these are mine. These are out there in the space. You can Google them, but the change curve describes the predictable process of emotions that we experience as we navigate change. And roughly speaking, it's denial, doubt, and acceptance. Sounds a lot like the stages of grief, and that's intentional. But if I can sort of anticipate that as a human race, those are things that we'll experience. And especially if I can recognize that we go through denial and doubt before we can get to acceptance, then I can normalize what I'm experiencing. And if I'm a people leader, I can understand that that's what my team is going to experience. And they'll do it all individually and a little bit personally. So it will look different person to person, but I can be prepared and ready to coach.
Yeah, there's a lot in there you shared that I think really resonates with me. One being, you can't control everything, but you do have influence, as you shared. We have a sphere of influence around what we can influence and what we can't. And I think part of being a strong leader is doing what you can to build your sphere of influence, so at least you can maximize your ownership of what you can drive through that change. But of course, that sphere does end and change is hard. It's super interesting to hear that parallel with change mirroring the grief curve. That's really interesting. I've seen the grief stages many times, and I've never thought about it from the perspective that change too can feel like we're going through a similar cycle. So what's your advice to managers and leaders, especially in this remote world, as they're navigating change? How can they support and monitor how their teams are feeling in the context of that change curve? Like, how can they tell where their team is at so that they can support them adequately? Because it is a lot harder now to get a gauge of that.
Yeah, it's a good question. One is you have to become a really good observer of human behavior, but I don't think that's hard. It just requires active listening and paying attention. So, taking time at the beginning of a one-on-one to just ask, how are you feeling? The answers and responses are really good signals as to sort of how someone is doing. Those three stages, they have signals attached to them. So when people are in denial, they're often blaming. They're blaming others or they're blaming themselves, right? Why is this change happening? Those why questions are a good sign that someone's in denial. The doubt stage are questions around uncertainty. You mentioned kind of that the link between the grief and the change, and that being interesting. Change is loss. It's a loss of something, a loss of work, maybe a loss of relationships, a loss of who knows, but that's why we feel fear. We're uncertain and we're doubtful. And so questions that are around like, what's going to happen now? What will happen to my job? What's going to happen in the future are signals that somebody's at the bottom of the change curve. And then the acceptance phase, some signals that you can know, that you can see and pay attention to, that someone's start moving towards that, are people get a little bit more self-reliant and creative and problem solving. They start to rationalize and ask questions of like, well, maybe this could mean I could do this in the future, or maybe this new manager means that I'll have opportunities for career development. All of those signals are ones to pay attention for, because you can help people move through the stages, or when someone's moving towards acceptance, you don't want them to slip. So you want to kind of jump and capitalize on those signals and encourage that creativity and that problem solving and that rationalization so they can keep moving on.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think what's interesting this year is that a lot of us are going through big changes together. And so maybe in years past, you see a lot of, okay, this team is going through this reorg, or, this one individual is having a new manager. Now, like in the flip of a switch, entire companies went virtual, entire roadmaps shifted based on, how we had to react to what was going on in the outside world. And so as a leader, how do you navigate that change curve with a broader group of employees, especially when there are a lot of people that are at different stages and, adapt to that change differently?
Yeah. I mean, at an organizational level, you got to delegate this down to managers. I always think that managers are the best people to arguably take the temperature of their team and take action with their team. When you're thinking about working from a manager perspective, your team will be at different, even though it's collective change that we're going through, which we are going through it now, we go through it at different speeds. So remembering that however much experience we have with change usually influences our ability to move through that curve. So it's normal to have people who will move through it a little more quickly than others, and others will get stuck in the denial and the doubt. Those people can be unintentionally toxic to a team, right? I mean, if you think about it, it's a lot of self-awareness and a lot of coaching on resilience. If I can't get beyond the blame, it's going to be really hard for me to get to a creative problem-solving place. And I need to sort of check myself when I'm in those early stages of the change curve and think about the responsibility I have to show up to my team in the best way possible, right? I can still feel those emotions, but I'm aware of them and I'm taking action with them. And if I'm new to change, hopefully I have a manager that can help kind of guide me through, provide me information, respectfully challenge me, help me kind of get to the stages where I'm moving on.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. As you think about how early managers should be thinking about communicating around change in the framework of this change curve, obviously this year there were some changes we couldn't really get ahead of, but generally day to day, within teams, a lot of times you do have the sense of, okay, this is up and coming, or this person's manager is going to change, or, this project is going to shift. What's your recommendation for how early people should get ahead of it? Is it as early as possible, or is there a sweet spot around that?
I think you can't eliminate these emotions in these stages. So you have to just understand that people will go through it. I think what you can do is anticipate maybe what questions people will have, or maybe their initial reactions as best as possible, and be prepared to sort of say, hey, if there's strong disagreement to the change, to explain the why behind it and the process that allowed you to get to that change, who the decision makers were, sort of what role you played in the decision. And it's tricky because sometimes you're in a position as a manager to have to convey a decision that you did not agree with, but it's sort of this disagree but commit. And, that's part of the work of being a manager, is you won't always be on board with the change, but you still have to communicate it and you still have to motivate your team around it.
Yeah, I think the commit is really important. I've seen so many circumstances where, you have a manager and maybe they don't agree with the decision that's made. They come into the room and they're like, well, I didn't really want to do this. This wasn't my decision. And then that gets pretty hairy because, you kind of lose the trust in some ways, because now your team doesn't see you as an advocate. They don't see you as bought in. They don't have clarity around where we're headed because there are a lot of opinions, and, you lean on your leader for that adoption a lot of times.
I would agree with you. Yeah, you can lose trust and credibility. I think you don't have to be a robot. I think you can express hey, I wasn't sure about this, but here's what I did to understand why the change was being made. And, here's why I'm working on adapting to this change as well, too. So I think there's a way to do it authentically if you disagree, but also without disrupting the credibility and trust that you've built with the team.
Right. And to your point, I think listening is a huge piece of it too, the act of listening early on, because a lot of times with change, I've also seen managers come in and they haven't actually solicited the information. They're driving this change, maybe preparing themselves for these various emotions that are going to come up, but perhaps there's more information that could have been gathered to inform the real direction that end result was going in.
Yeah, for sure.
You also, in your programs, you talk a lot about situational leadership and effective delegation, a framework that I love using myself. with my managers. And I think it's a great topic to discuss, especially now, because I think one of the hardest things that, people are going through is, in addition to all the stressors that you're dealing with externally, having a micromanager that is just virtually breathing down your neck, directing every move, or that opposite end of the spectrum where you have a manager that abandons you and doesn't give you the support that you need. I think these things really tie closely into psychological safety and trust, as you talked about earlier, and honestly, just the joy that we get out of the work that we do. So I'd love to, hear you tell us a little bit more about this model and how you coach managers around supporting their teams with effective delegation.
Yeah. So this is a model from Ken Blanchard. And to your point, I think it's a really useful model when it comes to delegating. I think even before the model, the first step in delegating is recognizing that you're not delegating. And I think that's true for everyone, no matter what your role is, but especially for people who are in people management positions. We are all holding on to work that we could arguably give out to somebody else. And there's a number of really valid reasons as to why, right? It's often faster to do it ourselves, quicker. We're on the hook for how it's delivered and what the output is. Sometimes we're doing work that we honestly enjoy doing and technically isn't our job anymore, but it's really hard to give up. So I tend to start there and remind managers that things had been delegated to you and continue to be delegated to you. And those are your opportunities to learn and grow. And you've made mistakes in the past and people worked with those mistakes. You did things differently and that was okay too. So by holding on to work, you take those opportunities away from your team. And I think it's really important to remember that because it's a mindset shift, delegating. Yeah. And then you can get into the how. And that's where I think situational leadership is really useful because quite simply put, it helps you understand where someone might need more direction or support depending on their level of skill or will. That's a kind of just a quick synopsis. So we go through four predictable stages of learning as we're working on a task. And at those stages, sometimes we need more direction, sometimes we need more support. We usually need some combination of both of those things, but I can turn the volume up on one or the other or both of them, depending on which stage I'm in. And I think that can be really useful for managers so that they feel like they're more specific and directed in their coaching.
Right. I think using that model gives you a really good sense of when to come in and teach and direct and really guide and navigate your team versus when you want to step back and really play that motivational role or that morale boosting role, supporting, guiding them versus really telling them what to do, coaching. I think that's really helpful because too often I think you see that balance really reversed and you have someone who's really experienced, who's done something for many, many years, and then you have their manager breathing down their neck, looking at their every email, at their every deliverable, editing every single last thing, and that can be incredibly frustrating. And, same thing on the other side of the token, you have managers that have employees that have never done something before and it's very high priority, it's very visible. They sort of step back and say, good luck, you got this, see you next week, and we'll sort of review. And that can be, equally scary and equally frustrating. So that balance is really critical to your success as a manager because without identifying that, you're not supporting your team in the way that they really need to be supported. And I think that impacts, engagement, trust, communication, so many different things.
Totally. And I think we all, even though there's not one type of delegation, I think each of those four stages requires a different type of management. I do think we tend to default to one or two. So I tend to default to coaching at what would be called a D4, which is lower amounts of support, lower amounts of direction, because I don't want to get in the way. I don't want to micromanage. I don't want to get in the way. And that's not what people need. So I need to be aware of that myself when I manage.
You want to empower people and you want them to learn and make their own mistakes. And there's definitely that balance. What do a lot of those directive and those directive and tactical types of support look like? And then what does a lot of the more coaching and that hands-off motivational support look like?
Yeah, I think on the directive behaviors, it's a lot around being really clear on the goal or the task, setting some milestones for goals, putting together some timelines, project plans, more of the details. Like, here's the what that you need to do. And I'm not a details person. I hate project plans, which is why I think I always shy away from the directive behaviors. Like, you got it, figure it out. But they're necessary. We need to know, like, what am I doing? How do I get started? What are my next steps? Those are all there. The coaching is really around listening, facilitating problem solving, asking good questions, providing recognition, advice, like giving feedback, like all the stuff of really helping you with the how and a little less of the what.
Right. Would you say that there is a good ratio of the types of projects that managers should delegate that require one type of support versus another? So, all projects that I delegate this one person, would you say that they shouldn't all require that tactical support, or it just differs based on the stage you're at in your career?
I think it differs based on the project, right? So like if I've got, for example, in my role at Floyd, we're revamping performance reviews. I'm feeling pretty good about that because I have a lot of experience with performance reviews. Now, hand in hand with that goes with compensation. I don't have a lot of experience in that. So I would need a lot more direction when it comes to compensation work than I would for performance management.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When you talk about what those directive and what those supportive behaviors look like, do you have additional guidance around what that looks like in a virtual world, or is it really one and the same? Have you coached your managers around employing strategies there?
Yes and no. And I think there's a couple of things here that I've been, when we do have conversations around it, it seems to be useful. One is ask people what they need, right? Now it relies on having a trusting relationship or some sort of level of trust. But sometimes I don't know. Do you need coaching right now? Do you need direction? Like if I'm unsure, I've just been really honest with my team and said, what do you need? Tell me. Or if I'm doing one thing and you think you need the other, tell me. If I disagree, let's have a conversation. But it's hard to read. I think we're all feeling fatigued from being on Zoom all the time. And so we tend to shorten conversations more maybe than we should. If a meeting's ready to end, let it end, even if it's not like reached the allotted time. But I think sometimes we could just like slow down a little bit at the beginning and the end of a meeting to check in.
Right. Yeah. And I think even with that Zoom fatigue thing, as I've reflected on it over the last however many months we've been working distributedly, there was, of course, that Zoom fatigue. But for me, I think it was less about, okay, I had 10 back-to-back meetings, and more about the fact that I had 10 meetings that were tactical and there wasn't this brainstorming element involved, or there wasn't that right balance of this was a directive type of meeting versus a supportive type of meeting for the type of project that we were working on. And so I think finding that balance is really helpful when you're virtual, and sometimes, asking, of course, can go a long way.
Yeah, I would 100% agree.
Great. And so you have started your role at Floyd. You've been there for about 8 months now, leading up the people and talent team, which is super exciting and a very different role than some of the roles you've had in the past. So how did you prepare for that? How did you jump right in and manage hiring, people operations? You talked most recently about comp and performance reviews. Like, how did you mentally prepare for that and then jump right in?
I don't know that I mentally prepared. I wish I would have. I didn't have a lot of time between jobs. So I did really jump in. I was lucky. I had been coaching the co-founders of the company before I joined. So I already had a relationship with the people that would essentially become my bosses. And that was helpful. And then I did something a little unusual where I wanted a start date that was in March, and they wanted things to start a little bit sooner than that. So in order for me to get some time off between jobs, but also satisfy when they wanted me to start, I did like 2 days of contract work with them. And I spent those 2 days having as many one-on-ones with people in the company as I could. And then I think I did another 2 days of that once I started. So it's like I had a pre-start and then a full start. And that was helpful. I had a one-on-one with everyone at the company to try to understand what they saw in this role, because it was a new role. And then I spent some time working with the co-founders to scope out what they wanted from the role and what I thought I could bring to the role. And I was really transparent about my gaps. I'm like, when it comes to people development, talent management, I think I've got a pretty good grip on that. But when it comes to core HR, these are things that I don't know. So I was just really honest and transparent. And we took that and we used it to sort of shape what the role was and where it's been. And it's also been helpful too, because over the past 8 months, I've been able to think like, what can I do more quickly? Like, what can I roll out and implement quicker? And then what are things that are going to take more time? And then what don't I know where I need help? And that's where I hire.
Yeah. And so you talk a little bit about how it was a brand new role. How large was Floyd when you joined? And were you the first people hired and built out the team, or was there a small people team that existed?
There was a person in place who's still at Floyd who did wonderful work in the people space. She was kind of doing it. I mean, she was with Floyd from very early stages. So, when I joined, we were 35 people. We're now 50, but, we're still small. And so Ariane is her name. She did wonderful work on starting to kind of put things in place and put some of these systems in place, but she was doing it kind of on the side in many ways. So when I joined, I sort of took what she had built and we're just really thinking about how we leveled some of these systems up as we scale.
Nice. I love that. And I love that you had the opportunity to define the role and, what it looked like. And so I'm curious, what did that initial roadmap look like? How did you decide what you wanted to prioritize? And are there initial projects or programs that you've developed that you're proud of?
Yeah, I feel like 8 months, I'm like, my gosh, what did I do in 8 months? I think there was a lot of work that was kind of quiet and behind the scenes and really just establishing myself as a person that is open to listening, open to coaching. I mean, if you've never had someone in the people space or HR to talk to, you're kind of hungry and waiting for that person. So I end up doing a lot of conversations with employees as needed. And then I mentioned it earlier, but one of the pieces of feedback I received in all my one-on-ones was that people wanted ways to grow at the company. So to me, that means a few things. Job pathing is one, and I've been doing a lot of work on that with the leadership team and the co-founders. To me, that also means continuous skill development. So we've been doing a lot of work on learning and development on these quarterly topics. And then another thing that came out was really building an inclusive culture. So the first hire that we made on the team was somebody who's focused on diversity, inclusion, and equity. And so we have done a lot of work in that space over the past few months too.
Yeah. Career pathing is just such a great exercise to come in and start with, because I find as a people leader, it's really enlightening. You come in and you get to learn so much about what the key drivers of success across the business are, and what that looks like at each level, how to communicate, how we think about growth. And so you learn a lot. You're working with so many leaders as you're building these pathways. And then at the end of it, you have this incredible product that you're able to give your employees and enable them to take the lead on their own growth. You can show how much of an investment it is, and you're really defining the function, the role of, the people function as you go through that initial exercise. So love that. One thing that I think is really cool about Floyd is that, as you said, it's based in Detroit. And a lot of the companies that you've worked at in the past are based in, Boston, in the Bay Area, really like hubs of tech. And so what has that experience been like, building, this company out in an area where, you're really part of defining the growth of the tech landscape there?
Yeah, it's really fun. It's actually, so a couple of things. I was born and raised in the city of Detroit. So when I moved back home, I said to myself, well, I would really like to work with a small organization. I've worked with pretty large organizations and I've had like consulting work with smaller organizations, and I like it. And I wonder if there's a business in Detroit that is growing. And I walked into the Floyd showroom just there to buy a bed. And I ended up chatting with this woman, Ariane, that I mentioned before, and somebody else. And the Midwest is a very friendly place. So we chit-chatted for a while, which is how I ended up coaching the co-founders. So it was a really, in many ways, organic introduction. It was so lucky to just find them. And it checked all the boxes of what I wanted. I wondered what it would like. I had been so focused on people management and leadership development skills for years. I was really ready to pick up my, look beyond and broader and think what is it like to work on a people team overall? So I didn't know if I was qualified to do the head of people role, but I tried to work with my imposter syndrome and go for it. And then to be in Detroit has been great. It's a shame that we're not in the office because it's a really nice office and it's fun to be there. And I know we'll go back. But we also have been using this opportunity of working remotely to expand our team. So while we have a lot of people that do work in Detroit, we have quite a number of employees spread out in other areas around the country. That's cool too.
That's really cool. And it's cool how you're able to kind of go back to where you grew up and bring all the skills that you learned along the way to a company based out of Detroit. That's awesome. As an executive on the team, one of the things that I'm sure that is a critical part of your role is really understanding where the business is headed and how you obviously support and grow the people team in alignment with that. You joined in March, which I'm sure there were a lot of quick changes that you were undergoing as a business, a lot of decisions that were made. And so how do you stay at the core of understanding, having that knowledge and that context of what are we doing as a business, and how do I support those goals from a people perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of really making sure that the relationships that I have are strong with the people who are in the spot of directing the business. So I mostly worked in tech before, in consulting. This is my first time working for a physical product company, essentially. So when I think about like where the business is growing, obviously I have a really close relationship with the co-founders who are the CEO and COO. I meet with them weekly. We talk almost every day. I work really closely with our head of finance because as we think about scaling the team, we obviously have to do so we're mindfully. We're post Series B, we're still young and early, so we can't just hire as many people as we want. So the head of finance and I kind of check ourselves and each other as to what's appropriate. And then the other kind of person I think I work closely with is our head of operations, our VP of operations, because he can help me understand like what's going on with the supply chain, which then helps me understand the experience of the customer and all of these sort of groups. So it's been really fun to sort of be a partner with all of these, with the people who are really driving the business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially now, being in the direct-to-consumer space, you really have to have, an especially strong understanding of the business because the environment out there is very dynamic. You have people that are working to get products to your customers, and that affects your business goals. And having a strong relationship with those within your company that, can speak to that knowledge can go a really long way. So switching gears a little bit, I'd love to dive into your own learning and development practices. I know you've been in the space for a long time and you facilitate and you teach so many people so many different things. But is there anything that you do for yourself to stay current and to continue to add to your own breadth of knowledge? Are there forums you go to or certain resources that you have found to be really helpful?
Yeah. I do read a lot of books. I try to kind of have one business book going, as well as one just non-business book. Honestly, I have a wonderful network of people like you who have been on people teams at different companies at different sizes. And I have asked for help so many times. And, to the extent that I can also give help too, yes. But I feel like right now I'm a little bit more of a taker than a giver. And I hope I can flip that ratio in the future. But I can't thank sort of my colleagues enough who just are willing to open up and give me advice and perspective on all of this. And so I learn from them probably more than anything else.
It's such a good community of people.
It's such a nice community. Yeah.
Yes. And there's just so much to learn from one another. I'm sure you can empathize with this, but whether you're at a really large company like Google or, an early stage startups, people are people. And the problems that we're solving are really, really similar. At the end of the day, people want to feel motivated and they want to feel like their job gives them meaning. They want that sense of community. And, especially right now, they really want that trust. They want to feel like that team trust. They want to be able to innovate. They want to be able to make time for self-care. They want to be able to try new things. And so, I think there's so much we can learn from each other.
Totally. It's a really nice group. And I'm just so thankful for it, honestly. Something that I think is really critical is psychological safety, which is that sort of idea of group trust and the willingness to take risks, appropriate risks, to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, to ask for help. I'm really keen on this topic a lot. Amy Edmondson is probably the biggest thinker in this space right now, and she has wonderful content out there. I also think like taking that content and having managers distill it down to really simple things that they can do with their teams is sort of where it really matters and where it can be really, really helpful. So I have been coaching a lot of our managers at Floyd and with other organizations that I work at and on the program that I run on really starting with like psych safety and knowing that it's a shifting dynamic. It changes over time. It's really affected by the internal and external environment of the team. But as we work remotely now, it's so easy to let it slip because there's just something about being apart from people and not being able to be in the same room together that can let you sort of feel like maybe you're just a bit more of an outsider than you were before. Yeah.
And that's dangerous because I think, at any successful company, you want to attract and retain the passionate people that care so much about, what it is that they're doing and, building those connections. And I think when psych safety starts to dip, meetings start to feel a lot more transactional. And that's when you lose that engagement and, you start to see turnover and self-doubt and people stop pushing themselves and, can really impact you.
Totally. And people want to be seen and heard. We know this, but they really crave connection. And I know like I'm missing that. I'm not feeling 100% connected to the work that I'm doing right now. And I don't think that I'm alone. And I think a lot of it is I'm sitting alone all day in my apartment and chatting to a lot of people, but not face to face or in person.
Yeah, no, it's hard. Well, on that note, I'll ask you one last question. As you're navigating, it's been a tough year for folks in the people and talent space, for everyone. And so what are some things that you like to do to take the pressure off, to spend time with yourself, to unwind and, self-care?
Self-care. I love self-care. I'm pretty good at self-care. Let's see, I read a ton of books. And something I've been interested in lately is paper cutting. So I like cutting designs out of paper. It's sort of like a version of paint by number or like coloring books. Like it doesn't require a lot of creative skill, but it's just a little craft that I find to be really peaceful. I can listen to music and do it. That's been a nice way to do it. I also think too that like I have connected with people that maybe I wouldn't have stayed in such good connection with. Like there's a few people where we just have like an automatic monthly catch up now on the calendar. And it started at the beginning of COVID when people were like, what is happening? Let's talk. And then making like a calendar event automatically repeatable, I'm finding it's actually really, really good. It takes the scheduling hassle out of the way and it keeps me in regular communication with folks that I don't get to see.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think living, working, sleeping, breathing, all in the same space has brought a level of intentionality around how I spend my time. And I think I've been definitely going more out of my way to chat with a very diverse group of people because I'm craving that connection more. And I'm actually having more interactions than I did probably before COVID. But no, it's been good. And there's also, like to your point, like I find myself doing so many different things, so many crafting things and learning new ways of, like making bread and all of the things people did.
Oh, yeah.
So, love that. Well, I really appreciate you taking time to come on the show. I feel like, our conversations always leave me with so much to mull over. You're just a box full of knowledge, both in terms of, frameworks, things that stick, and also something that I can go out there and apply. So it's always so fun chatting with you. And thanks so much for sharing your story and your experiences.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really nice chatting with you, Ruska, and catching up.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe for the weekly drop and feel free to share around with your people and talent colleagues. I'd love your feedback, so please leave a review and let us know what you enjoyed and what types of topics you'd like to see covered in the future. The more reviews and subscribers we get, the more quality content we can consistently deliver to you. If you're interested in being on the podcast, feel free to reach out to me at russica@engageandempower.org. See you next week.